The Middle Ages often feel like a distant, grim era. But if you look more closely, you find people who lived amid disease, war, and constant uncertainty, and still managed to keep their homes warm, raise children, work, hope, and believe. In this video, we'll explore what everyday life looked like, how people treated illnesses, how artisans and peasants worked, what role faith played, how communities endured epidemics, and why they held together. For all the hardship, life kept going on a surprising foundation: human resilience. Friends, we're happy to share some news. We've launched a second channel. It's called Quiet Pages. There, we talk about books by great authors, not by retelling plots, but by trying to understand what was happening in the writer's life while they were creating the story, why the characters act the way they do, and what's hidden between the lines. A new video is already out about Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince. The link is in the description. If you like our approach, please drop by and subscribe. Your support truly matters to us. And thank you for being with us. Village and field, the life of an ordinary person. When you picture the early Middle Ages, the first image is rarely a bustling city or royal court. More often, it's a small village tucked among hills, rivers, and plowed zemlí, fields that fed everyone and decided the future. Life there moved slowly and changed little, obeying the seasons, the whims of weather, and the authority of the lord who owned the land, along with the roads, mills, and even the pastures where peasants grazed their livestock. Most villagers seldom traveled beyond nearby settlements, and it was here, among timber huts with thatched roofs, that the world we now call medieval took shape. People usually rose with the first light, when a gray dawn seeped through cracks in the shutters, and roosters kept in almost every yard had already started calling. In cramped homes where several generations might live under one roof, often alongside animals, mornings began quickly. Someone coaxed the hearth to life, someone checked whether the animals had wandered in the night, someone went to the well for water. Smoke climbed over the village, its heavy smell mixing with damp earth, creaking carts, and the soft rustle of a day waking up. A peasant's house was simple, sometimes harsh. Wattle and daub walls held to a wooden frame, the roof was straw. Furniture rarely went beyond a few benches, a rough table, and a chest. Floors were packed earth, and beds were straw pallets replaced infrequently. There were always more urgent tasks. Cleanliness and comfort existed, but by different standards. What mattered most was warmth, safe storage for grain, and a place to survive the winter. Spring brought some of the year's most important work. Men led oxen into the fields and wrestled heavy wooden plows through wet soil that tried to swallow them. Women tended small kitchen gardens, gathered firewood, cared for children, and watched the animals. Summer meant endless chores: weeding, haymaking, guarding crops, driving livestock to distant grazing lands. And yet, even in that pressure, there were brief pauses, moments to sit in a tree's shade and stare across the wide, flat earth that decided whether the family would endure. A 10th-century English chronicle mentions a peasant family led by a man named Edwin. Each year they went to the fields together. Men hauled the plow, women scattered seed, children picked stones and piled them at the edge of the furrows. They worked almost silently because they understood that sowing too little or too late could mean begging the Lord for help, and help came with debts, extra obligations, and humiliation. It's a small story, but it shows how tightly a peasant's life was bound to land and how little control he had over his own fate. In autumn, when harvesting began, the village rhythm changed completely. People worked from dawn until darkness, stacked sheaves into tall ricks, dried the grain, and prepared it for milling. Part of the crop went to the Lord, another share to the church. Those weeks made it clear what the next year would be: generous or anxious, stable or hungry. Winters were hard. Cold lasted long, and homes were heated with small fires because wood had to be rationed. Work slowed almost to a stop. Men repaired tools, women spun and sewed, children helped around the house. Even then, there were quiet evenings of closeness, everyone gathered by the hearth, listening to elders tell stories. Holidays mattered. At Easter, the village met by the church, shared food, and exchanged modest treats. At Christmas, evergreen branches appeared indoors, symbols of life and hope. Sometimes winter brought games, circle dances, and old tales, stories passed down through generations, giving people a sense that time was unbroken. Travelers were rare, but memorable. One pilgrim monk passing through Normandy wrote that a family fed him sourdough bread and simple ale. That evening, the chazyaika, the mother of the house, spoke about her little son helping in the fields for the first time, and an older daughter learning to spin wool. For the traveler, it became one of the warmest nights of the entire journey. Details like this remind us, even in relentless labor and poverty, there was still room for hospitality and human closeness. The church held a special place in village life. It was not only a house of prayer, but a center of community. Disputes were settled there, marriages made, children baptized, and the dead farewelled. The priest was often the only person who could read, knew the calendar, understood legal custom, and could tell people about events beyond their world. The church year set the village rhythm, and the bell signaled work and rest. Yet beneath the outward steadiness was constant vulnerability. One failed harvest could bring famine. The illness of a semyeni kurtsilets, the family's main worker, could ruin a household. A fire could erase everything. Nature did not bargain. Drought, a rain-soaked summer, early frosts, any of these could erase a year of labor. Border regions also suffered raids, after which people rebuilt homes and started again. And still, life continued. People valued their house, family, land, livestock, good relations with neighbors, and rare moments of rest. The village world was simple, but it had its own stability, its own inner logic, its own sense of time, something modern life has almost lost. Castle and knight, the world of the feudal lord. When the Middle Ages are mentioned, the mind often jumps to a knight in mail standing on the walls of a stone castle, fields and villages stretching around him. But a knight's reality was far more complicated than the familiar image. A castle was not a romantic fortress or a luxurious palace. First and foremost, it was a fortified administrative and chazyaistveni center, an economic hub, an organized system of labor, duties, and defense. Everyone had a place, and every action fit into a larger order. Morning in the castle began early. As soon as pale light filtered through narrow windows, the knight rose from a heavy wooden bed in chambers accessible only to a few trusted servants. The room was plain: stone walls, a chest for clothing, a table with the steward's notes, a fur throw near the hearth. From the open door came the sound of the courtyard already awake, grooms cleaning stalls, servants carrying sacks of grain to the kitchen, women kindling fires, squires dragging shields, swords, and mail into the sunlight to check for rust. A Flemish chronicle tells of a knight, Hugues de Sants, who had a habit at dawn. He walked the inner walls and lightly touched the stones, checking whether any had loosened overnight, whether guards had secured the gates, whether anything threatened those inside. It was less a duty than a ritual, an everyday reminder that a castle survived only through constant attention and work. Afterward, he went to the great hall for a simple morning meal: bread, boiled grains, a little cheese, and jugs of ale. At the table sat not only family members, but stewards, senior servants, sometimes peasants who came to discuss practical matters. They ate quickly. There was always more to do. A knight was not only a warrior, he was the land's manager and judge. Disputes over fields and boundaries, requests for assistance, repairs to the mill, rozprzędzenie powinności, the allocation of obligations, all passed through him. Burgundian records from the 10th century describe a day in the life of a knight named Renaud de Pont.
After breakfast, he settled a quarrel over garden borders, inspected hay stores, received a miller whose wheel had broken, and trained 2 young squires sent by a neighboring lord. The point is clear: a knightly life was constant movement between household governance and martial duty. Military training still stood at the center. Almost daily he practiced in the yard with lance, sword, and shield, and supervised squires who absorbed every gesture and correction. A Norman tale recounts a boy named Alain riding his lord's war horse for the first time. The animal was spirited and dangerous, but the knight, standing nearby, ordered him to hold on until the end of the circle. Alain trembled but endured. Later, asked what kept him from falling, he said he felt his lord's gaze and understood he must prove worthy. That is how knightly formation worked: example, mentorship, and a bond of trust. The castle rarely fell silent. Hammers rang in the forge, cauldrons simmered in the kitchen. In the hall the stewards sorted parchments. Children ran between weapon racks. Women managed the household, spun, cooked, and taught daughters how to keep a home. Boys grew up among the smells of iron and leather, surrounded by talk of war and service to the king. At midday the knight often rode out to inspect his lands, alone or with a few riders. These rides were necessary. He needed to see whether the fields were tended, whether any plots were neglected, whether mills worked properly, and whether peasants met their obligations. A monk named Thierry wrote that a knight, Arnaud de Giraud, toured his holdings at least 3 times a month, and more often when rumors of raids spread. Evening drew life back into the great hall. Supper might include stewed meat, fish, vegetables, bread, and sometimes wine. They discussed news, negotiations, letters from neighbors, church matters. Sometimes wandering singers arrived and filled the hall with songs of old exploits and famous wars. One chronicle preserves a story about a ballad describing a knight returning from a campaign with a damaged sword because it had been left in dampness. Struck by the detail, the lord ordered his own weapons checked and found a faint trace of rust on one blade. A castle was not only the knight's home, it was a refuge for those living on his land. In danger, peasants drove livestock inside, fled with bundles of grain, and crowded behind the walls. A chronicle about a raid in Britain notes that residents of an entire valley reached Lord Guillaume's castle in a single night and lived for days in tight quarters, sharing food but feeling safe. A knight's life was rarely calm. A king could summon vassals at any time. A neighbor might start a legal feud. Bandits could appear on the roads. Even quiet evenings felt like temporary relief that could end before dawn. Yet human warmth existed here too. Firelit nights when a knight told his children stories from past campaigns, steady conversations with a wife who managed the castle during his absences, prayers after a long day. Chronicles seldom dwell on such moments, but they're what let us see a living person behind iron and stone.
Birth, family, and growing up. When a child was born in a medieval family, it was not only a private joy, it became part of the community's larger rhythm. Every newborn promised continuity of the line, ukreplenie hozajstwa, strength for the household, future help, and the sense that the world, however difficult, would go on. Birth rarely happened in silence or solitude. In small houses and castle chambers alike, people gathered, ready to bring water, feed the fire, speak encouragement, and call women skilled in helping at such hours. Midwives held a special place. They were experienced women who knew many techniques, prayers, and herbs to ease labor and help a mother keep her strength. A 10th-century German chronicle mentions a midwife named Gertrude, summoned even from neighboring villages. Over many years she had taken so many infants into her hands that people called her the woman who brings light. She arrived with a small bag of dried herbs, linen strips, a vessel of oil, and even a sprinkler, because a weak child might need holy water immediately. Details like these show the seriousness and reverence surrounding a new life.
After birth, the baby was wrapped in warm cloth, sometimes moistened with herbal infusion, while the mother was steadied with warm drink and calm. Almost at once they prepared for baptism, believing it important not to delay the child's entry into the community. In some places, infants were baptized within days, sometimes the very same day if the church was near. The priest recorded the name in a book where a human fate began to be written. The first months were dangerous. Babies often fell ill, suffered in the cold, and did not always receive enough nourishment, so early death was sadly common. If a child survived the first weeks, parents saw it as a blessing. One English record tells of a family that lost 3 newborns in a row. Only the fourth, a boy named Thomas, lived. The father left a short, piercing line: "The Lord has returned hope to us." Across centuries, such words show how closely joy and grief stood side by side. As children grew, they were gradually drawn into daily work. In villages, boys of 5 or 6 already helped their fathers, carrying water, watching small livestock, gathering twigs, running errands. Girls learned from mothers to sew, spin, cook, and care for younger children. Games existed, but time was scarce. Rag balls, wooden figures, quiet play near the home. Even play, however, taught endurance, attention, and how to get along. In knightly families, the path differed. Boys around 7 or 8 were sent to other castles to become pages and later squires, an important stage of maturity. They learned obedience, care of weapons and horses, riding basics, and rules of conduct and respect. A letter by Lady Alice de Senenclair describes her son Roger crying at night from homesickness during his first days as a page, yet within weeks he sat confidently in the saddle and rode with older squires. Such stories show how early the world of duty began. Girls were trained to run a household: cooking, clothing care, family management. But they also learned prayers in the feast calendar, and in wealthier families could acquire reading and writing. In some regions, girls were sent to convents where they worked with texts, copied prayers, and learned the basics of literacy. One French monastery mentions a 9-year-old girl, Isabella, copying short prayers so neatly that her lines were used as examples for younger sisters. Adolescence brought near adult responsibilities. Village boys plowed and worked beside their fathers. Girls managed the home, cooked, spun, and cared for the little ones. By 15 or 16, many did work indistinguishable from their parents. Weddings were central community events. In villages, everyone joined. Ale was brewed, bread baked, homes decorated, and the whole community walked to church together. A Danish record describes a wedding where the bride and groom moved through the village with relatives, while children scattered fir branches at their feet. In castles, weddings mattered even more. They linked families, lands, and interests. A chronicle of a lord's daughter's wedding says guests arrived from several neighboring holdings, bringing fabrics, jewelry, and rare spices, while servants laid tables for more than 50 people. Family life rested on labor and mutual support. The husband worked fields and livestock, performed heavy tasks, and protected the home. The wife managed household supplies, children, and stores. Many sources show women also kept records, traded at local markets, and, when husbands were absent, ran the entire estate. One English tale tells of a woman named Martha who, during her husband's illness, plowed the land herself, raised the children, and saved the family from ruin. Old age and death were natural parts of life. People aged quickly. 40 was considered fully mature, 50 already old. Elders lived within the family, told stories, taught prayers, and passed down experience. When someone died, the whole village came to say goodbye. The body was brought to church, prayers were read, and then the person was buried in the cemetery by the hram, the church. Life and death were seen as 2 stages of one continuous path.
Bread, beer, and medieval food. When you look closely at medieval life, you realize food was not merely domestic detail. It was the foundation of the entire yearly cycle, the measure of stability, and a constant source of worry and labor. People did not separate meals into everyday and special in a modern sense. Food was tied tightly to nature, to farming rhythms, and to church rules. Whether autumn was generous determined not only comfort, but whether a family could survive winter at all. The central product was bread. It stood at the heart of every table, from the poorest peasant hut to the castle hall. In most villages, people baked dark loaves from a mix of rye, barley, and oats. The flour was coarse, the bread dense and filling, lasting a long time even if it wasn't soft. One English parish record mentions a miller's family baking bread every few days, each fresh loaf becoming an event. Children waited for the moment they were allowed to break off a still warm piece. Small details like this show bread was more than food. It was a symbol of work and future hope. Wheat bread was rarer, appearing in wealthier homes and among knights, and even there it signaled something out of the ordinary. Wheat demanded mild weather, good soil, and a calm season, conditions European nature did not always provide. Beer was just as important. Everyone drank it, adults, children, the elderly, because water was often unsafe, especially in villages where wells became contaminated faster than they could be cleaned. Beer was brewed from barley, flavored with herbs and later hops. A German village story mentions a midwife known for beer considered gentle and warming because she added a special blend of dried herbs. People came to her not only for help with childbirth, but also for the prazdnichny napitok, holiday brew she made. Diet depended entirely on the season. Spring was the hardest. Stores ran low, new greens only began to appear, and people survived on thin pottages made from dried peas, leftover grains, and whatever root vegetables had kept. Chronicles often mention the phrase "hungry spring," emphasizing how brutal the period could be. One English document records a family of 4 near the end of spring eating oat flour mixed with water and salt because their bread was gone. Easter eased the strain. Fresh vegetables appeared, along with dairy foods and eggs. Autumn was the richest time. Root crops were stored, honey gathered, hay made, meat salted, and supplies prepared. Winter narrowed the diet again to dried, salted, and smoked foods, mostly porridge, soup, and bread. Meat was rare for peasants. One French note describes a farmer slaughtering a piglet and inviting the entire village to celebrate his son's 7th birthday. Such a gesture counted as luxury. Castle food was richer, but daily meals still tended towards simplicity. Bread and cheese for breakfast, grain dishes and ale. For midday, stew, vegetables, and fish. Meat appeared a few times a week. Only on major feasts or when hosting guests did the table become truly abundant. The church strongly shaped diet. Fasting days filled a large portion of the year, and during these periods people avoided meat, dairy, and fatty foods, relying instead on fish, vegetables, and grains. Monasteries could be stricter still. Some orders ate only bread and water on certain days. A Benedictine rule notes that food should be moderate, plain, and received with gratitude. Fairs held a special place in cuisine. There one could buy things absent from daily life: honey cakes, salted fish, rare cheeses, small bundles of spices. A description of the Champagne fairs tells of a peasant named John buying with his wife a pinch of cinnamon, a tiny luxury she added to home brew only on holidays. There were also years of catastrophe. Chronicles repeatedly mention seasons when rain destroyed crops or early frosts killed seedlings. In such months, people ate whatever they could find: old root vegetables, wild herbs, spoiled grain. One record says villagers survived on water mixed with a little flour, almost all they had left. And yet, even then, people tried to help one another. Priests wrote about neighbors sharing handfuls of grain with families that had many children. But joy existed too. At Christmas and Easter, tables were set in ways never seen on ordinary days. Cheese, honey, bread, a little wine, smoked meat or fish. In one English parish, there was a custom of dividing one large loaf among all families after Easter service as a sign of unity.
Food in the Middle Ages was not only strength, it was social glue. It set routines, formed habits, held people together in hardship, and gave them reasons for gratitude in times of plenty. Bread, a jug of beer, and a shared pot of stew were more than nourishment. They were the heartbeat of the community.
Home, clothing, and everyday life. To get closer to medieval people, you have to step into their homes, where every object had a purpose. Every corner reflected a family's means, and every smell spoke of daily existence. Houses were practical and undecorated, built with the understanding that warmth, shelter from wind, and storage for supplies mattered more than ornament. Village dwellings were made from local materials: wood, clay, straw. Walls were woven branches coated in thick clay. Roofs were thatched, warm and relatively easy to repair. Floors remained earth, gradually packed hard by endless footsteps. One English note describes a peasant building a house in a single summer by working each evening after the fields. The house stood for more than 30 years, and despite frequent rains and winter winds, its walls never needed a complete rebuild. At the center of nearly every home was the hearth, the source of warmth, light, and life. A pot hung above the fire. In cold months, the family gathered around it. Smoke escaped through a hole under the roof, but often lingered inside, filling the room and soaking into clothing and everyday objects. Women spent much of the day by the fire, cooking, mending, watching children. Children often played nearby because it was the warmest spot. Furniture was scarce. A few benches, a roughly made table, a chest for clothes, sometimes a wooden cradle. People slept on straw mattresses. A Bavarian record notes children sleeping on one wide straw pallet, renewed each spring when the mother brought fresh straw. The old straw was never wasted. It became bedding for animals or fertilizer for the garden. Castles were different, but the essentials were similar. Stone walls protected yet brought cold, eased only by fabrics, fur, and heavy wooden construction. Great halls held massive tables used for meals and meetings. In the knights' chambers stood a bed, clothing chests, and fur coverings. A letter from Lady Alice de Marley says that in winter she layered several sheepskins over her children's bedding because water in a jug froze by morning even inside the rooms. Lighting was dim. Beeswax candles were expensive, so many used tallow candles or oil lamps fueled by animal fat. Their light was uneven, burned out quickly, and left dark soot marks on walls. Monastic notes often mention brothers reading rules by the light of a single lamp placed in the middle of a long table, each person waiting for the flame's reflection to reach his page. Clothing was sturdy and practical. In villages, people wore rough wool and linen dyed only in shades made from local plants: browns, grays, muted greens. Men wore shirts and trousers with long tunics on top. Women wore floor-length dresses and headscarves. In one Norman village, clothes were passed down between generations. A shirt might serve 3 or 4 children in a row. Wealthier people had softer, better fabric. Castle women wore linen and fine wool, sometimes embroidered, and on feast days, dressed in bright colors made with costly dyes. One description of a castle at De Vere mentions a cloak embroidered with silver thread, passed from mother to daughter for generations. Laundry was exhausting. Instead of soap, people used ash. Clothes were washed in cold river or stream water. One English chronicle tells of a woman who caught such a severe chill washing clothes by a river in winter that she remained ill until spring, and the entire parish took on her duties so her family would not be left without help. Humanity was limited. People bathed redco, rarely, mostly in warm seasons. Some villages had shared bathing days by a riverbank or in simple wooden bathhouses. Castles more often used wash basins, jugs, and towels. Even some kings and great lords had private baths with heated water. Everyday comfort came from small things. The smell of bread baked every few days.
neatly tied bundles of firewood by the door, ceramic jugs filled with water, baskets of stored vegetables, small woven curtains blocking drafts. A Danish note says a woman decorated her simple house with a wooden cross and a few knitted ribbons, and neighbors claimed hers was the warmest home around, even though it was as plain as the rest. For medieval people, the home was the center of life. Shelter from cold and bad weather, a place where modest stores were kept, where children were born, where evenings passed in quiet talk and the crackle of fire. Things lasted a long time, were inherited, and became part of a family's story.
City and craft. To understand how the medieval world changed, you have to imagine a city, a place where life moved faster than in the countryside, where people met, worked, argued, struck deals, and filled every day with sound, smells, and voices. The city was a dense knot of craft and trade, and it produced a new kind of person, the artisan, the master, the merchant, the apprentice. Streets were winding and narrow. Houses stood so close that upper floors almost touched, and on sunny days light barely reached the pavement. A description of late 10th century Bruges says that if two neighbors leaned from their windows, they could touch hands, capturing how tightly people lived. The air was full of smells, fresh bread, leather, smoke from hearths, fish and spices brought by traders from far away. The market was the city's heart. It opened at dawn, and with the first shouts of sellers, people from surrounding areas poured in. Stalls displayed vegetables, cheese, honey, cloth, shoes, tools. You could hear women and children laughing, merchants cursing as they argued over prices, and the town crier announcing news and orders from the council. One German chronicle describes a market in Lübeck where 3 fish sellers and 5 buyers argued at once, and the crowd was so tight the crier had to raise his staff twice before anyone could hear him. Yet the true core of the city lived behind the low doors of workshops. There craftsmen worked daily: smiths, cobblers, weavers, carpenters. Each trade formed a guild, a brotherhood that guarded production secrets, set standards of quality, and ensured skills passed from generation to generation. In cobblers' shops, men softened leather, stretched it over lasts, and stitched soles with thick thread. In forges, hammer blows rang on anvils from morning till night. In weaving houses, threads were stretched on big wooden looms, and the shuttle's rhythmic paradak, clack filled the street. A Florentine letter from the 10th century says looms stood so close you could hear your neighbor breathe, and that the tightness created a sense of shared labor. The road to mastery was long. Boys became apprentices at 12 or 13, moving into the master's home and doing the hardest tasks: carrying water, chopping wood, sweeping shavings, kneading leather, cleaning tools. One French record tells of a boy named Pierre rising with the master before dawn and sleeping only after the last tool was put away. After years, the apprentice became a journeyman. He could complete certain tasks alone, earned a small wage, and sometimes could sell work at the market under the master's name. One tale about tanners speaks of a journeyman named Jacobi who cut leather so confidently that the master only occasionally reminded him about the sole's thickness. To become a master was both an honor and a challenge. One had to produce a masterpiece, an object proving skill, patience, and precision. A cup, a knife, a shoe, a woven pattern, jewelry. The guildmasters examined it and decided whether the person deserved the title. Minutes from a Paris carpenters' guild mention a young man's work accepted unanimously because every line showed a hand that understood wood. City life never stopped. Journeymen moved through streets with baskets of tools. Merchants shoved carts forward. Women discussed prices. Children chased sellers of sweets or roasted chestnuts. Sometimes processions passed, religious, festive, or guild parades.
In one German town, weavers marched with a large drum, each carrying a wooden shuttle as a sign of the trade. Fairs were special days awaited all year. Traders arrived from other lands with new goods, rare fabrics, spices, jewelry, books. A description of the Champagne fairs says Italian merchants brought bright cloth unseen in northern cities before, and locals approached carefully as if touching something miraculous. Artisans used fairs to show their work, find customers, trade extra goods for materials. One record mentions a jeweler who brought a single brooch each year, made over many months, and crowds gathered simply to see his new creation, even though few could afford it. Of course, the city was not only festive. Disputes flared over market spaces and workshop locations. Laws forbade working at night because noise disturbed residents. Rules banned throwing waste into streets, though many ignored them. An English record says an artisan was fined 2 silver coins because refuse from his workshop lay for days near the city wall and blocked passage. Still, the city gave people what the village often couldn't: a chance to learn a craft, communicate, exchange knowledge, and change social position. Many arrived seeking work or skill and stayed forever, finding in crowded streets a new sense of life. The medieval city was thick, noisy, saturated with voices, hammering, and smells, and in that web a growing class formed for whom skilled hands and careful work became the foundation of their world.
Faith, fear, and miracles. To understand the medieval inner world, you have to imagine how naturally and deeply faith was woven into daily life, not as an occasional ritual, but as the constant environment in which people lived, worked, thought, and chose. A person began and ended the day with prayer, interpreted major events as signs from above, and met hardships as tests of spirit. Faith was present at home, in fields, on roads, in sickness, and in prazniki, feasts. It was the invisible tkань, fabric, that bound the community. The church stood at the center. In villages, people gathered there not only for services, but for advice, news, and discussion of shared matters. Time was measured by feast days and weeks, not calendar dates. An English parish record notes a peasant recalling events by saying "before Easter" or "after Pentecost," showing how the church year felt more real than any other timeline. Family prayers were common. A small marginal note in a French prayer book says an eldest daughter read a short prayer aloud each morning to her brothers and sisters. On Sundays, the entire community went to church. If someone failed to appear, it immediately raised questions. Absence was treated as a sign of illness, trouble, or biada, misfortune. The priest was not only a spiritual guide, but also a practical helper. He wrote letters for those who could not, reconciled families, settled disputes, comforted the sick, taught children prayers. One German village priest, Matthias, recorded a day in which he baptized a newborn, comforted a widow, helped resolve a land dispute, and spent evening copying prayers for parishioners. Such lines make it clear the priest was a quiet pillar of community life. But medieval spirituality extended beyond official church practice. It included many small customs and beliefs passed down through generations. People believed certain days were better for beginning a journey. Some forest places should be avoided at dusk. Before harvest, one should toss a few ears from last year's crop onto the field. In one Norman village, the first spring fire was lit from a charcoal ember saved from the previous winter, symbolizing continuity and hope for a good year. Pilgrimage held a special role. People walked to holy sites, sometimes huge distances, alone, with family, out of vow, or in desperation. An English story tells of a woman named Edith walking to the shrine of Thomas Becket, praying for her husband's recovery. The journey took nearly 2 weeks. She slept in kind households or under open sky. A note left after her return says the road was hard, but hope walked beside her, capturing the courage that sustained pilgrims.
Alongside Christian rites lived folk superstition, not sharply separated from faith. During storms, people placed rosemary on windowsills to protect the house, hung garlic bundles above doors, left bowls of water for the souls of deceased relatives. In a Bavarian village, women close to childbirth wore small herb sachets believed to help. The priest might not endorse such customs, but often tolerated them, understanding that fear needed comfort. Stories of miracles were part of everyday life. People told of the sick improving after prayer, saints appearing in dreams, icons helping in hard times. A French parish recorded a boy who, villagers claimed, began to recover after his mother brought water from a holy spring. The priest wrote it down cautiously without calling it a miracle, but noted that the family found consolation. Patron saints mattered deeply. Many communities had a particular saint invoked most often: Nicholas for travelers, Martin for farmers, Margaret for women in childbirth. One English village held an annual procession for St. Margaret, in which 12-year-old girls walked with small wreaths, symbols of entering an age when they began real żeńska robota, women's work. Faith infused labor, too. Before plowing, peasants prayed for mild weather. Before building a house, for strong walls. Before a journey, for safe return. In workshops, one could see small crosses nailed to walls or lying near tools. A Flemish cobbler once wrote, "Before I begin a new pair of shoes, I place my hand on the little cross so the work will go smoothly." Faith also accompanied the hardest moment, the end. When someone died, neighbors came to pray with the family. The priest brought a candle, and the body was covered with clean cloth. One old note tells of a miller escorted in silence by the whole village to the church because people believed he had done enough good over many years that everyone should come to say farewell. The medieval spiritual world was complex, deep, full of hope and fear, yet it gave people a sense of support in a life ruled by forces they could not change. Faith became the basis of inner strength, and the church the place where many found comfort, help, and meaning.
Illness, war, and change. To picture the later Middle Ages, you must see how fragile human life was, and how, alongside that fragility, people preserved a remarkable strength rooted in accepting hardship and continuing forward in a world where disease, war, and upheaval were not exceptions, but constants. There were no guarantees of safety, but there was a resilience that helped people endure loss, keep working, and live on even when the future felt uncertain. Medicine developed slowly, relying mostly on observation, experience, and knowledge passed down through generations. In villages, healing was often practiced by herbalists, women and men who knew plants, gathered them on particular days, dried them, stored them in small bags or clay vessels, and brewed remedies. One English record mentions a woman named Agnes who every early autumn went to a forest edge to collect oregano, mint, angelica root, and St. John's wort. Locals said her remedies helped those who lay with fever for a long time. In cities, physicians existed who were familiar with ancient and Arabic medical writings. They used bloodletting, poultices, and powders made from imported herbs. Such help was not available to everyone, so many still turned to monastyrskie leczebnicy, monastic infirmaries, where small gardens of medicinal plants were kept. A Benedictine monk who oversaw such a garden wrote that every herb had a purpose and served humans as humans served God, an image of respect for nature's healing power. But no herbs could stop epidemics. Disease spread quickly, especially in cities where people lived close together, traveled more, crowded markets, and lacked modern hygiene. Fevers, intestinal infections, internal inflammations were common. The most terrifying was an epidemic that swept parts of Europe in the mid-10th century. Contemporary records capture confusion and fear. In one Italian town, a priest wrote that 3 sick people lay in a house and no one would bring water because neighbors were afraid to enter. Elsewhere, people noted burials happening so often that cemetery space ran short. Even in fear, people tried to help.
In one French village, several women voluntarily cared for children whose parents had fallen ill. Some of these women later became sick themselves, but the memory of their help remained long in the community. Such stories show that when medicine failed, compassion and wzajemna mutual aid, still held life together. Alongside disease came war, present throughout the Middle Ages. It could begin from a feud between neighboring lords, a dynastic dispute between kings, rival cities, or clashing families. War was rarely distant. It touched everyone, those who marched and those who stayed home. One Norman record says that in early spring, a troop of horsemen passed through a village and took part of the stores because they had nothing to eat on the road. For a family barely surviving winter, it was a crushing blow. Sieges were especially draining. People sheltering behind castle walls or city fortifications could live for months on scarce supplies, enduring cold, thirst, and illness. A description of a French castle siege notes residents lasted more than 3 months eating pea flour and drinking rainwater collected in barrels. The chronicler wrote that they held steady because they knew there was no other refuge outside the walls. A soldier's life was brutal. Armor restricted movement, weapons were heavy, wounds often became fatal due to infection. Arrows, spears, and swords tore deep injuries, and even survivors might be left disabled. One knight describing a campaign wrote of a comrade who survived an arrow wound but could not lift his arm for weeks until the injury closed enough for him to hold a lance again. Still, warriors saw service as duty. Young men trained with weapons early, and joining a campaign was treated as a significant part of male life. In a letter from an English knight sent home after a long campaign, he wrote that he treasured the sword inherited from his father and hoped one day to pass it to his son, if God preserved peace or granted strength to continue serving. Despite illness and war, life slowly changed. Cities grew, crafts diversified, trade routes lengthened. People traveled more, exchanged knowledge, and learned from neighbors. New tools appeared, new books, new ways of seeing the world. A German school record mentions children seeing a book printed on a press for the first time. The teacher wrote that the boys stared as if they were seeing a new sun, because the identical, even letters looked like a miracle. Attitudes towards disease began to shift too. Physicians recorded observations more often. Monastery libraries stored recipes. Herbalists passed knowledge not only to children, but to apprentices from other places. The world remained fragile, but people gained new ways to strengthen it. And still, the most important thing was this: a medieval person learned not only to endure hardship, but also to keep inner calm, to find joy in small things, support neighbors, raise children, care for the land, and discover meaning in daily work. Danger was part of life, but strength came from the habit of accepting that danger and continuing anyway. That concludes our story of how people of that era lived between illness, war, and change, and how their endurance became one of the foundations of the new age that followed the Middle Ages.